Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning into today's show. Happy Tuesday here on this lovely Tuesday afternoon. We are going to be talking a lot about certain things in the fantasy football world, including last night's game between the Dolphins and the Rams. Highly unusual, not many good fantasy performances, but still we look at them ever the same. Then we go on to the waiver wire. Some hidden gems still out there, potentially to pick up for a late fantasy playoff push if you feel like you need to supplement your team. Of course, continuing to talk about our positional rankings, running back and wide receiver for today, and concluding today's show with my fact versus fiction segment, presenting some bold fantasy takes for the week and either justifying them or debunking them. But before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you yet again that if you want more content such as this or exclusive short content, please consider liking, following, and subscribing to this show on the network, not just on YouTube, but anywhere you can find us on Twitch, Geo7, other websites, what have you. But if you do want to interact more directly with the show and communicate and interact with me personally, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, like I say, keep this show as interactive as possible. Just makes it that much better. It's greatly appreciated. You can do one of two things. Either click that $ in the chat box in the comments section, leave a tip or donation, or go to our website, gsmcpodcast.net, or also just leave any burning questions, comments, or concerns you have throughout the show about anything I talk about, or just something you might be wanting to know about. Fantasy advice, trade advice, what have you. I am all ears. Without further ado, let's jump into our first segment of the day, and that will be our Monday Night Football recap. Like I said, it was not the prettiest of games, not the prettiest in terms of a fantasy perspective either. Highly defensive stalemate here between these two teams. But ultimately, the Dolphins pulling off the shocking upset in LA, 23-15. And I was truly impressed with what the Dolphins were able to do, not just offensively in the short periods of time where that offense got moving, but on the defensive side of the football. They had a lot of injuries, especially in the secondary in that game, very late as well. So the Rams hypothetically could have come back and they had more opportunities, but I was really impressed by how, despite all those injuries in their secondary, they were able to hold up and ultimately keep the Rams from even scoring a touchdown. They did their job spectacularly last night. But we also have to look at the offenses. And the offenses weren't necessarily pretty. Even the Dolphins, which moved the football, I believe, a little bit more effectively than the Rams. They were able to punch in a couple of chances when they got into the red zone, whereas the Rams struggled in that area of the field. And so I do want to acknowledge these defenses, especially the Dolphins, and we'll get to them in a minute. But I also have to look at the kind of ugly nature of this game on the offensive side of the football. Let's start off with the performances of the quarterbacks. Let's start off with Tua in particular, because there were some really nice things that Tua did in this game, but there were a lot of plays that he and a lot of fans of the Dolphins perhaps would have wanted to take back. It was 20 of 28, 207 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, only 8.18 fantasy points on the night for him in this one, but he still got the job done. There was a lot I liked. He was able to find the holes in the Rams secondary over the linebackers, and I really liked the route concepts that McDaniel was coming up for him, and he wasn't necessarily forcing the issue. That being said, still took too many big hits, took a lot of sacks, and ultimately plays that you don't necessarily want to have happen to someone like Tua, who's already been injured and concussed, especially so many times before. So while Tua played, quote-unquote, the better of the two, even though comparing him to Matthew Stafford last night isn't necessarily the best example, he still had some negative plays that he would have to eliminate from his game should, this win bolster and help elevate the chances of the Dolphins going on a late run here. And the reason why I was non-committal about Tua's performance was because of the fact that I was more impressed by the defense, and we'll get to them in a minute. But Tua's performance week in, week out seems to be serviceable in nature. Yes, we know how excellent he can be. We know how this Dolphins team looks with him at the helm rather than a guy like Thompson or Tyler Huntley. So it's going to be all about how Tua plays within himself, plays within the structure of the offense, and most importantly, preserves himself. Because I do feel this win is a positive for the Dolphins. It's a stepping stone for this stretch run for them, because they are still very much in playoff contention in that loaded bottom half of the AFC. So if Tua can continue to, play supplementary / complementary football in this offense, then I think the Dolphins are as good as gold to potentially go on a sneaky little run there in the AFC. On the other side of things, Matthew Stafford, pretty disappointing. Threw the football a lot, 46 times, 32 completions, 293 yards, 1 interception, 9.72 fantasy points. He did have some very nice throws, but the problems with this offense came in the red zone. Simply could not punch it in, especially on that last drive when they kicked the field goal, then went to the onside. It was very disappointing for the Rams to come away from that possession without, a touchdown when they could have had it. So, Matthew Stafford, I'm also non-committal about in terms of this performance, because I feel like, he was doing things right in the open field. He had a nice rapport going with both Kupp and Nakua, also incorporating guys like Robinson and Parkinson into this scheme. But he fell up short in the red zone, and that's what mattered in this game. And I do feel like the Dolphins secondary could have been exploited a little bit more later in this game, especially in that late fourth quarter where there were so many injuries in that secondary for that Dolphins team. But it is what it is. Matthew Stafford's going to have to erase this game from his memory and continue to go again, because he's going to have multiple opportunities, especially in that NFC West division. Win your divisional games if you're the Rams, and chances are you could sneak into the playoffs. So this game, it's not necessarily sweat out the back. It's kind of a disappointing setback for this Rams team, but they go again. And I feel like Matthew Stafford will go again. Let's stick with the Rams in terms of the fantasy perspective still before we give our full plaudits to the Dolphins defense. Let's talk about the only true positive on the offensive side of the football. It's not a receiver, it's a kicker, which just goes to show how important kickers can be from a fantasy perspective. Joshua Carty, a very impressive rookie out of Stanford, 5 for 6 in terms of field goals, couple of 50-yarders too, a total of 18 fantasy points. That's like a little over wide receiver 2 projections in terms of point production from a kicker, a rookie kicker at that. And as these kickers improve, they're starting to become more and more integral in terms of how you view them from a fantasy perspective. Because a lot of college kickers as well, if you monitor things such as that, which you probably might not, but it's still pretty interesting, are beginning to elongate their range. And it's showing up in terms of how they translate to the NFL, and most importantly, into how they translate on paper and fantasy. Because these stats are unheard of for a rookie kicker who a quote-unquote peripheral playoff team are entrusting with that job. And so, in this game, when the Rams couldn't get anything going, for him to make 5 of 6 field goals, effectively do his job, is pretty impressive. So kudos to Joshua Carty for stepping up in a highly difficult game for this Rams offense. And now let's get into the Dolphins defense. 1 interception, 1 fumble recovery, 4 sacks, only 9 points in terms of fantasy, perhaps because of the field goals the Rams hit, but ultimately highly impressive front-to-back performance from the Dolphins in terms of the front seven. Calais Campbell taking it back a couple decades with that performance, playing much younger than his 36 years of age. On the back end, I talked about them a lot. A lot of injuries to different guys like Kohu, like Cam Smith, the backup. It's they had to keep on rotating in and out, but they still held their own and ultimately kept the Rams out of the end zone all night long. So kudos to the Dolphins defense, even though not necessarily showing up stats-wise in terms of fantasy production, still a fantastic performance for this Dolphins defense. And last but not least, a guy who I kind of wanted to pinpoint, maybe could have dropped him in my waiver wire segment coming up next, but still a very intriguing performance from this young man. How about Malik Washington? I was talking to my dad during the game about this guy because I could not believe what I heard when I heard his name. The rookie out of Virginia, someone who I hadn't heard of since his game-winning touchdown and upset of North Carolina last year. And seeing him in this Dolphins offense, he really looked like someone who could become their next gadget guy. 2 touches, 35 yards, 1 touchdown, a pretty pedestrian 10.5 points. Pretty unordinary, mundane performance, but still one of note in terms of how the Dolphins use certain players and get the most out of their traits in this offense. They can continue finding guys late in drafts and developing them into potent weapons that they can use on the perimeter. Then chances are this offense is going to continue to grow and mature under Mike McDaniel. Malik Washington looks like a gem. And he was perhaps the bright spot in this Dolphins offense because much like the Rams, they didn't necessarily move the ball that much outside of the Malik Washington touchdown and a touchdown later in the game. But it was noteworthy that they can find this guy and get him some meaningful touches in his first NFL touchdown in this one. So kudos and congratulations to Malik Washington on a very intriguing game. Let me know what you think of the comments about this game. Pretty weird one from a fantasy pinpoint perspective. But coming up after this short break, we'll be talking about the waiver wire. Which hidden gems could still be out there and help you in terms of making a fantasy playoff push. We're going to talk about that right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign.